Today's daf we're going to be learning Makkot Daf Yutet. This week's learning is sponsored by Sarah Averick and Jose Rosenfeld in loving memory of Sarah's beloved Aunt Rose. Rachel Bat Chaim Nisan Halevi V'Nechama. She was a Yiddish scholar who adored all her nieces and nephews. She was a beacon of light, laughter, and joy. Right, we're going to get started. I'll remind everyone that we're doing our siyum at the regular Zoom time in the morning at 7:15, inviting everyone who the time of day allows for them to join the siyum live. We'll finish the Masechet and do the Hadran. It's a bit of a different kind of siyum this time, just because of time constraints and holidays and all that. Okay, I didn't say Friday? Sorry, this Friday, in case that wasn't clear, this Friday morning at 7:15 in the morning, Israel time. Okay, and it gives people an opportunity who don't normally join the Zoom to join the Zoom, and it's also a nice opportunity. We're going to start from the bottom of Yuchet Amud Bet. Amar Rava bar Ada, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak. So we're going to start the daf with a question. We're going to end the daf with a similar question on something else, which is just kind of like a nice start end. Rava bar Ada says in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak, bikkurim me'ematai mechayvin alehen. What kind of chiyuv are we talking about? Rashi tells us we're talking about mitat zar ochlan. A non-kohen is not allowed to eat the bikkurim. However, we're going to learn that they're not really officially considered bikkurim for this purpose until a certain point. What is that point? So he says, mishiru pnei habayit, when they get into the temple. Until they get into the temple, they're not actually bikkurim yet. They don't have the sanctity of bikkurim. Now, a zar can't eat something like truma, for example, that has sanctity to it. So if they don't yet have sanctity, and you eat them, you're not supposed to do that, but you're not going to get lashes because they're not yet sanctified. Kiman, who does this go according to? Ki Tana, like the Tana, who appears in the following braita, Titania, Rabbi Eliezer Omer. So now we're going to learn that Rabbi Yitzchak here, who's quoted by Rava bar Ada, is going to hold like Rabbi Eliezer. Because he says, bikurim miktsatan bachutz umiktsatan bifnim. If they're a little bit inside, a little bit outside. Okay, we could end our daf also with another case of half in, half out. A little bit inside, a little bit outside. So we have, let's say, a pile of bikurim, first fruits. Some of them are already inside, some of them are outside the temple. Shebachutz harein chulin l'chol derives. The ones that are outside are completely non-sacred. Shebifnim harein heikesh l'chol derives. And the ones inside are sanctified for all intents and purposes. So there you see that clearly Rabbi Eliezer held that if it doesn't yet go into the temple, it's not sacred. If it's not sacred, well, then you're not going to be liable for eating them if you're a non-kohen. Okay, that was very easy, simple sugya. We're going to move on, and now we're going to get to the more complicated media sugya of today, which is going to end only at the top of Amud Bet. So I'm going to break it down for you to make it easier to see what we're doing, and I'll always kind of go back to the flow. So we're going to start with a statement that it's going to sound exactly like the previous. We're going to start with a statement of an Amora, and then we're going to bring a Tannaitic source to prove it. But here it's going to get a little more complicated because the Tannaitic source itself has three parts to it, or at least I separate into three parts. Maybe you could call it more, but I separate into three bigger parts. And then we're going to reject the suggestion that this Tana is the one who Rav Sheshet holds by. Okay? And then after we do that, okay, so the first part is statement of Rav Sheshet. Then we're going to move on to say, oh, he agrees with Rabbi Yishmael as appears in the following braita. We're going to bring the braita with the three parts to it. Then Rav Ashi is going to say, no, you can't prove it from there. And here's why. And then we're going to go back to different parts of the braita. And that's why I thought in my head it would be easier if we split the braita into parts. We're going to go back to different parts of the braita and ask some questions about them and resolve some issues that we have with the braita itself. So by that point, we'll be out of, Rav Sheshet holds like Rabbi Yishmael, and we're just going to be dealing with the content of the braita itself. So let's start now that we understand the structure outside and start learning. Amar Rav Sheshet, bikurim hanacham ma'akevet behem kriya ein ma'akevet behem. Okay, now we're going back to the topic we were discussing in the previous stuff, which is when it comes to bikurim, Rav Sheshet is of the opinion, we saw different opinions about this, that in the bikurim, putting it next to the altar is critical. Okay, that means if you don't do that, and then again, the kohen then eats the bikurim, which he's not allowed to do until the essential parts were done. The essential part that has to be done is putting it near the altar, but not the reading of the mikra bikurim. So Kiman, according to who does this go? Ki haitana detanya, like the following Tana, as it says in the braita. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Rabbi Yossi Omer shlosha dvarim mitoch shlosha zkenim. Rabbi Yossi said three things in the name of three different elders. We're only going to hear one of them. They don't bring us the entire braita. And now we're going to hear what one of them is. So Rabbi Yossi said that Rabbi Yishmael Omer, Yachol ya'aleh adam maaser sheni b'zman hazeh b'Yerushalayim v'yochlenu. He says the following. You might have thought that nowadays there's no temple. People still can bring their maaser sheni to Jerusalem and eat it there, which really means, right now, yachol is always going to be, you might have thought in a braita, but it's not the case. Okay, so we're going to prove how we know that you can no longer eat maaser sheni anymore, because you can only eat maaser sheni in the walls of Jerusalem, and you can only eat them in the walls of Jerusalem when there's a temple. And that's what we're looking to find out the source for. Vidinhu. So the first way we're going to do it is to attempt to make a logical argument. That's what always vidinhu is. It's a logical argument, which in this case is what logical argument? Often it's a kal vachomer. This isn't exactly a kal vachomer. It's a bameh matzinu. A bameh matzinu is a, we can compare this to this. They're the same. Okay. And then we're going to say, oh, they're not really the same. Okay. And that's going to knock out our bameh matzinu. So stage one, okay, we're going to say the three parts of the braita. Let's try to prove it logically. Stage two, rejecting the logical explanation. Stage three, we're going to learn it from a pasuk, from a heikesh. If you remember what's a heikesh, a juxtaposition in the verses, which is not a logical, but more like this is what it says in the Torah. Okay, and it's not exactly it says in the Torah, but it's a drasha we can get from the Torah itself. So first, let's try the logical argument of the bameh matzinu. Vidinhu. Bechor ta'un hava'at makom. Maaser sheni ta'un hava'at makom. Here we have two things that are the same. One is bechor. Bechor is bringing the firstborn animal. Okay, don't get confused between bechor and bikkurim, because we're going to talk about both of them today. Right? Bikkurim is the first fruits you bring, and you put them near the altar. Right? The kohen puts them near the altar, and they do the waving, and then the kohen can eat them. Then we have bechor, which is the firstborn animal. And that you have to give your firstborn animals to the kohen. So it's similar, but one is animal, one is produce. And there the kohen has to sacrifice it, assuming it's not blemished. Okay, if it's blemished, and we're going to get to that at the end of today's stuff, you can actually eat it without, the kohen can eat it without sacrificing it. But the kohen then has to sacrifice, if the animal is not blemished and can be brought on the altar, has to sacrifice it on the altar, sprinkle the blood, burn the parts on the altar that get burned, and then can eat the meat. So now it says, bechor ta'un hava'at makom. The bechor needs the temple. Obviously, it needs the temple because you need to put the blood on the altar. You need to sacrifice it. So it needs the temple. And maaser sheni ta'un hava'at makom. And also, maaser sheni needs Jerusalem. They each need, this is how they're similar, and then we can learn one from the other, also needs bringing it to the temple. Oh, not to the temple, but to Jerusalem. They both need a location. Ma bechor eino ele b'fnei habayit, af maaser eino ele b'fnei habayit. Now, even though you could put some holes in this argument, because one is temple, one is Jerusalem, Jerusalem's still there, even though the temple's not there, but still, he says the following, since the bechor is only when the temple is around, and since they both need a specific location, right? So, just like bechor is no longer relevant, and you can't bring your bechor anymore, likewise, maaser eino ele b'fnei habayit. What do you do, by the way, with bechor? We're going to get into this when we get to Masechet Bechorot, which is, right, I'm giving you a preview to all the sugyas and kachim we're going to get to, right? There's a whole thing about you have to wait till it gets blemished. Some famous Mishnah I remember about, the animal got really old and still wasn't blemished, and they tried to figure out a solution, because this animal was just, kind of waiting to be slaughtered, and there was nothing they could do about it. Anyway, we'll get to all that later. Okay, that's the premise of the argument. Section 2, rejection of this argument. Okay, and this is what we would have said. This is the biggest hole you could poke in this argument, which is bechor needs blood on the altar, needs the imurim to be burned on the altar. Those are the parts of the animal that get burned on the altar. Okay, and therefore you can't learn from there the maaser sheni, which has no need for the temple. So they're two very different things. In fact, there's no more temple. Of course, you can't do bechor, but it doesn't mean you can't eat your maaser sheni in Jerusalem. So the Gemara rejects this argument, and this is all within option 2. They're going to say, wait a minute, in section 2, Bikurim yochichu. Wait a minute. Maybe you could learn from bikurim will prove bikurim doesn't need sacrificing on the altar, and yet bikurim also isn't done when there's no temple. So the combination of the two could teach it to you. Because, right, this doesn't have that same chumrah, right? And therefore you could learn from bikurim. So they say, what do you mean? It doesn't have that chumrah, but it has a different chumrah. Mala bikurim shekain to ani manacha. Bikurim also needs putting near the altar. In other words, both bechor and bikurim need something having to do with the altar, and therefore you can't learn from either of them to maaser sheni. So we're back to square one. How do you know maaser sheni can't be eaten in Jerusalem? So again, I'm just going to keep reviewing this so we get it. Section 1, okay, we don't remember why we're here. We'll get back to that. But if we just look at this braita right now, which is a little easier to just focus on the content of the braita. Section 1 was let's try to prove logically the maaser sheni can't be eaten in Jerusalem from a bameh matzinu. Let's learn it from bechor. Rejection of that can't be learned from bechor because bechor is a special chumrah that maaser sheni doesn't have. And even if you want to say bikurim also could teach it, but between bechor and maaser, they each have their own chumrah, and therefore you can't learn from either one of them to maaser sheni. Section 3, Talmud lomar. Okay, well, if we can't learn it from a bameh matzinu, let's learn it from a pasuk. And like we said, a heikesh from a pasuk. It says, you should eat before God, which usually means in the temple, right? In the place where God chose to dwell there. Right? Maaser and bechor. Now, it obviously doesn't mean eat in the temple because you don't have to eat maaser sheni in the temple. So what does it mean, right? Both those things, by the way, the meat of the bechor and the maaser sheni both have the same law. You have to eat them inside Jerusalem. You don't have to eat them in the walls of the azara in the temple. But because they both say Lifnei Hashem Elokecha, before God, and in the place where God chose to dwell, and we know that bechor can't be eaten except when there is a temple, so therefore maaser sheni must be the same thing. You can only eat it when the temple exists. Okay? And there we have it. So let's read it again inside. Makish maaser lebechor. We can make a heikesh between maaser and bechor. Ma bechor eno ela lifnei habayit. Just like bechor is only when there's a temple. Av maaser eno ela lifnei habayit. Thus ends the braita. So section 3 of the braita is the way we actually learn it, and we do learn it from bechor, but not from a logical argument, but from a heikesh. Okay, very clear. What does this have to do with our topic? Well, we wanted to know because that wasn't our topic. Our topic was this hanacha ma'akevet behem, right? So now we have to go back to the one line that was relevant for that. Remember what they said about bikurim, right? Because again, the whole thing here is all about bechor and maaser sheni. We were trying to find a source for bikurim, that hanacha is the critical part and not the essential part, and not the kriya. So now they say, look back to what they said. They said in section 2, the bikurim, what makes the bikurim? What's the chumrah of bikurim? That came to unim hanacha. They need placing near the altar. So what did they prove from here? Notice, what did they say? In itat, if it was really the kriya was ma'akevet, kriya was the essential part, lifroch, it should have said, mala bikurim, came to unim kriya ve'anacha. If kriya was an essential element of it, it would have said kriya and hanacha, or kriya or hanacha, right? Instead of hanacha, if kriya was the only one, and if both were essential, then it would have said both. So when it said bikurim, the fact that they ignored kriya must be a proof that the reading of the text is not so critical. But as I told you before, Rav Ashi is going to reject this. Amar Rav Ashi, nihidi ikuva leika, mitzvah mi leika. Okay, I understand you want to claim it's not essential, but it's obviously a mitzvah to do kriya. Nobody thinks that there's no such thing as mikra bikurim. It says so in the Torah. In which case, v'lema mitzvah v'lifroch. When the Gemara is listing what's unique to bikurim, they don't need to only list the things that are essential. They could have said, and it has mikra bikurim that you're supposed to say, even if you don't have to say it. But the fact that it's part of the mitzvah and there's something that's unique, right? Because it's unique, even if it's not essential, it's still unique. It should have been listed there. So Rav Ashi comes and says, the fact that kriya is missing from that line doesn't prove that it's not an essential part. There must be a different reason why it's missing. Because even if it wasn't essential, it should have been listed there. Because again, all we were trying to do, we weren't trying to make any halakhic statement about bikkurim of what's essential, what's not. All we were trying to do is say we can't learn from bikkurim to maaser sheni because bikkurim has something unique about it. And unique about it is both hanacha and kriya. So there must be a reason why kriya was omitted and not the reason that you thought. And therefore, in the end, taking Rav Ashi's statement, we're going to reject the fact that Rav Sheshet, which is where we started, Rav Sheshet, who said hanacha is critical, but not kriya, is not going to be able to connect it to this Tannaitic source. We tried to say Rav Sheshet must be relying on Rabbi Yishmael. We're now going to say no, because kriya is missing for a different reason, and that's what we're going to end this part of this section with. Amar Ela Amar Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi explained why is kriya missing. Kevan deika bikuri hager tebai lememar asher nishba Hashem lavotenu v'lo matzei amar lo psikale. A ger who brings bikurim does not say mikra bikurim, because mikra bikurim, this is fascinating, because you would think, right, gerim, we make them as if, they're part of our community completely, but there's a few, right, there's certain things a ger can't do. A ger can't say, this is the land you promised to my forefathers, because it's not true. So they actually don't do the mikra bikurim. And because, and this is also fascinating, because, at least Rav Ashi's theory, why they don't mention kriya, because not everybody does it, because gerim, converts, don't do it. Therefore, lo psikale. It's not, forget about essential, not essential. That's not what we're saying. It's not a necessary part, really, or it's not always for I shouldn't say that, not necessary. It's not always there for everybody. So therefore, you could say it's not necessarily one of these chumras that we would say, oh, that's a stringency that appears by bikurim, because there are cases where it doesn't, which would be in a convert's case, where there's no obligation, even it's not even a mitzvah for them. So therefore, they only mention hanacha in that braita and not kriya. That's his theory. Okay, take it or leave it, right? It's not the most convincing, but it's a possibility. Okay, thus ends our section, but not really, because what we did so far in this section, again, if you come from the eyes of Gemara, the Gemara brought Rav Sheshet saying hanacha and not kriya is what's essential. We tried to bring a Tannaitic source of Rabbi Yishmael, from the fact that, again, he was really talking about maaser, sheni, and bechor. But in there was one line that talked about bikurim. From that line, we tried to prove it. Rav Ashi said, can't prove it from that line. So now we don't really have a source for Rav Sheshet, and the Gemara is going to leave that. Okay, we don't know what Tana he holds by. Okay. But now the Gemara has some questions with the content of the braita. So now we have to put on different glasses, because there we were on the Rav Sheshet, thinking about Rav Sheshet and the bikurim. Now we're going to really talk about different parts of this braita. So again, in part one, we tried to create a bameh matzinu argument saying, we remember the question of the braita. The question of the braita was, perhaps we still are supposed to be taking our maaser sheni to Jerusalem and eating it there, which actually has like different elements to it, which is number one, we're obligated to bring our maaser sheni to Jerusalem. Number two, we're actually allowed to eat our maaser sheni. Right nowadays, we redeem it onto a coin, and then the coin has to be destroyed because we can't do anything with it because we can't eat it in Jerusalem. And that's really right. It's not only are we not obligated to eat it in Jerusalem, but we actually can't even eat it at all because we don't have Jerusalem as we need it to be able to eat it there because there's no temple. And we try to learn that from bechor, that's stage one, from a bameh matzinu. They reject the bameh matzinu argument because they say bechor is chamor, and even if you say, well, bikurim also, but bikurim also has a stringency. And then in the end, we learn it from a heikesh. That was stage three. So stage one is the attempt to prove bameh matzinu. Stage two is rejection of that. Stage three is where we actually learn it from the heikesh. So now they say the following. Now we're going to ask on section two. And that's why I divided it so we could see, because then they're going to ask a question on section one. So first they're going to ask a question on section two. Now in a bameh matzinu, which is, this is like that, so therefore this is similar, we're going to say the same thing, which is what we tried to do here. But then we rejected and said, but that's chamor. And then we said, but, not necessarily because bikurim. And then we said, but bikurim has the stringency. Now, if you remember, we've done this many times. We say, wait a minute, but let's take the least common denominator between bechor and bikurim. And basically what we're going to say is, since bechor doesn't have the stringency of bikurim and bikurim doesn't have the stringency of bechor, right? Why don't we say that that can reject that, and it's not that stringency which causes this din, it's not this stringency, and that's a bameh atzad. We should go with the least common denominator. What's the least common denominator between bechor and bikurim? Both of them need to be done in a particular place, and both of them are only done when there's a temple. Why don't we then say the same thing is true for maaser sheni? That also needs a special place, and therefore may be only done in the time of the temple. So that's the suggestion, but the Gemara says, no, mishum deikala mifra. That's not the least common denominator. You can knock it out and say, because both bikkurim and bechor need the altar. And that is not true for maaser sheni. One needs burning on the altar and putting the blood on the altar, and the other, the bikkurim, needs putting it down before the altar. So they both are associated with the altar, which obviously, right, when there's no temple, there's no altar, although we're going to talk about that too. And therefore, they reject that argument. Okay, so it can't be done with the bamatzah. So that was question one on the braita, which we resolved. Now we're going to go back to the original premise. What was obvious to the Gemara is that you can't eat the meat of the bechor once there's no temple. And therefore, you can't eat maaser sheni when there's no temple. But now they want to know, why are you assuming that? My kasavar, what were you thinking in the first place? We're now back to the very beginning, the first part of the braita. Ikasavar, now, why is it obvious that you can't eat bikurim anymore? Bechor anymore. You can't eat the bechor. Right? The obvious answer was because you can't sacrifice it on the altar anymore. Well, now we're going to go back to this machloket about kedusha rishona kitcha l'shata and kitcha l'atid lavo or not kitcha l'atid lavo. So let's go back. Ikasavar, if you hold kedusha rishona kitcha l'shata v'kitcha l'atid lavo, if you think that the sanctity of the temple stays there forever and the sanctity of Jerusalem, afilu bechor nami, then theoretically, and this is why I said maybe it's not true, maybe once there's no temple, you can still put up an altar there. So you don't have a temple, but so what? Remember we said even if you don't have walls, you don't have a bayit, you can still put up an altar. And now we're going to take what we said in the previous sugya, and earlier that we learned, it was either a daf or two ago, and say, what that means really is that you don't need a temple to have an altar. I can just come, build an altar, and start offering sacrifices where the temple was. Because, right, as long as I know the place where the temple was, the sanctity is still there. I can just do that. So maybe bechor nowadays could be done. Okay, and then, right, so that's number one. Afilu bechor nami, and then the question should be about bechor. Maybe you can do bechor. And that wasn't the question. So he says, it can't be that. So in other words, again, we're trying to figure out why it was obvious to the braita that bechor for sure you can't do when there's no temple. So it can't be that they thought that the kedusha is still there. But even if you hold the kedusha is not still there, we're still going to have a question. If you're going to say, well, the sanctity is no longer there until we rebuild the temple, and then you think, oh, it's obvious you can't eat the meat of the bechor anymore. Well, afilu bechor nami tibai. It's not so obvious. The Gemara still could have asked a question about bechor. Now, it's going to be a bit of a rare question, but there's actually a lot of sugyot that do this, which is, what if the following thing happened? What if the temple was still there? I bring a bechor to the kohen takes it, sacrifices it on the altar, sprinkles the blood, burns the imurim, takes it now out of the temple, and it wants to eat it. And then temple's destroyed right then and there. Now, can the meat be eaten? Not necessarily. In other words, this should be the same question. Meaning a question should arise about bechor as well, and it shouldn't be so obvious that bechor can never be eaten when there's no temple. Because it could be eaten in a case that the blood, because if it needs the temple, and that's the whole issue, because you need the altar, well, what if we neutralize that part because that part was done? And then, right, so it's a bit of a theoretical question, but it's still a question because it's theoretical, right? It might be theoretical, but it's a question. The question should have been asked on bechor as well. So Amar Ravina, so now we don't understand what the Tana was thinking, because if the Tana didn't ask that question, then which one did he hold? He can't hold it's kitcha l'shata v'kitcha l'atid lavo, because then you would be able to do bechor, and it can't be that, because then they should have asked. It can't be there is no kedusha, because still there would be a question for bechor, and it wouldn't be so clear and obvious. To which Ravina explains, like the second option, lo olam kasavar kitcha l'shata v'lo kitcha l'atid lavo. Okay, it wasn't sanctified for the future, but why didn't they ask about bechor? And hacha bebechor shenizrak demo kodem korban abayit b'charav abayit v'adayin b'saro kayam, meaning it was still obvious to him, even in that case, where the blood was sprinkled, the imurim were burned, and yet it was still obvious that you can't eat the meat. Okay, the meat wasn't eaten yet. Why? Because makshinam b'saro l'damo. Okay, if you look at Rashi, he's going to show us where this heikesh is. The pasuk says, Ve'et damam tizrok al mizbech. This is about the bechor. You should sprinkle the blood on the altar. And then a few other words. Ubisaram yihiyeh lach. And then the meat will be yours. So notice it says you have to sprinkle the blood on the altar, and then the meat is yours. So they say we're going to do a heikesh. Again, a laws of juxtaposition. Since the blood and the meat are, and the eating of the meat is right next to each other, we're going to say, so I'm just finding it inside. Ma damo b'mizbeach, at besaro b'mizbeach. Just like the blood is done on the altar, also the meat has to be done when there's an altar in existence. And because of this heikesh, it's obvious to them. Okay? So that explains why it's going to be clear, why in section 1 it was totally clear. Now, if we jump ahead to section 3, what in the end did they learn? In other words, now we're just going to put everything together. Section 1 is based on the obvious premise, and that's why it was obvious to them that we're going to learn it from bechor. Or really, in section 1 it was logical, but anyway, the whole premise of everything we're saying is that whether we learn it from logic or whether we learn it from a heikesh, it's all based on the premise that bechor for sure can't be in a time when there's no temple. And that we just proved from the dam and the basar being next to each other in the pasuk. And in the end, the way they learn it then is then they make another heikesh. Since we just learned that the meat of bechor by heikesh from dam, from the blood, can't be eaten except when there's an altar. And then we already had a heikesh. That was what they said, right? Lo, you eat before God the maaser and the bechor. And that juxtaposition teaches us that whatever's true for bechor is true for maaser. That sounds very nice, except for one thing. What I told you in the previous classes is that there's a special laws about kodshim in terms of the way drashot work. There's a few rules. We learned one of them already, which is if something's written twice in the Torah, that means it's essential. If it's written only once, right, that was the whole machloka between hanacha and kriya. If it's written once, then it's not essential. And it's a law, a rule of drashot, which is unique for kodshim only, for temple-related things. Well, there's another rule. Okay, we're going to learn all these in Zvachim, but it's nice we're learning it now already, which is, because Zvachim is our next Seder, and we're done with this, Kodshim is our next Seder, which it's going to get into these things, but particularly in Zvachim, where it talks about all the sacrifices. Another rule in Kodshim is you can't do a double heikesh. A heikesh from one, and then learn a heikesh to the other. In other words, it's going to be called this, you can't take, okay, what did we do? We did a heikesh from blood to meat of the bechor, to the food of the bechor, to eating it. And then we did eating the bechor to eating maaser sheni. But that whole eating of the bechor was already learned out from a heikesh. And there's rules when it comes to kodshim, sanctified items, that you can't do a double heikesh. Learn something from a heikesh and then learn that to something else. Now, in the laws of non-kodesh, you can, but not in heikesh. So the Gemara answers, what do you mean? Maaser dagan chulin maaser sheni is not heikesh. It's whole, right? It doesn't have sanctity to it, maaser sheni. So that's why. Okay, because again, if we get into the world where it's outside of kodshim, we can do a double heikesh. So that resolves our problem. But turning now to Amibet, the Gemara says, well, it depends. Because there's two parts we're using for this heikesh. There's the part that we're learning to, which is maaser sheni. That's what we're going to call lamad, the part you're learning to, lamed, the part that's being learned to. And then there's the milamed, there's the part you're learning from, right, which is the bechor. And that is kodesh. So there's a machloket when we talk about a heikesh, a double heikesh. Is it only, do we determine, does the rule apply because it's kodesh, or does it not apply because it's whole? Which issue we use, the one that's being taught or the one that's teaching. Now, not always you're going to have that issue because it might be they're both kodshim or they're both chulin. But in this case, we have a double. We have one is chulin, one is kodesh. So hani chalaman damar, we have an answer and we can explain it well if you say batar lamedas lina. If you go based on the item that's being taught, which is maaser sheni. We're trying to learn to maaser sheni, and that's chulin, and therefore we have no problem with this double heikesh. But if you go by the one that's doing the teaching, which is the first heikesh, which is bechor, how are you going to explain that? And then you can't have a double heikesh. So we're stuck according to, I don't know, let's say 50% of the people, right? Whether you hold by this or whether you hold by that. So damu basar chadam milti. In the end, they're going to say that first part about the dam and the basar is not really a heikesh. It's just that the dam and the basar are the one and the same, okay? If you can sprinkle the blood and you have to do it when there's an altar, obviously the meat you have to do when there's an altar, and it's not even learned by juxtaposition, even though we said before it was. We just say, well, it's just obvious they're all one and the same. We neutralize the fact that there's a heikesh there, and then we only have one heikesh. Once it's just all one thing, and therefore basar, clearly the basar can only be eaten in the time of the temple. Therefore, we're going to learn a heikesh to maaser sheni. And from there, we resolve this whole drasha of Rabbi Yishmael, which again, that was already outside what we were trying to do in the sugya, which was all just Rav Sheshet and Hanacha Ma'akevet and trying to prove from bikkurim. We got totally off topic because we were just analyzing this bechor, maaser, sheni, which weren't even our topics. Okay, but now maaser sheni is going to be our topic because the next thing in the Mishnah is, okay, kodshi kodshim chutz l'klaim, you get lashes for, but it's really the next thing, which is, I'm just going to go back and read it inside. Then it says, maaser sheni chutz l'choma. Okay, or kodshim kalim also. But the real thing we're going to deal with right now is the maaser sheni. If you eat it outside Jerusalem, also kodshim kalim, like bechor, for example, is kodshim kalim. If the kohen eats it outside Jerusalem, or the maaser sheni you eat outside Jerusalem. Now the Gemara says, and you might not remember this because we had a long list of things, but on Daf Yud Gimel, in the first Mishnah of the chapter, when we said these are the people who get lashes, we actually listed maaser sheni already. It's a maaser sheni and heikesh shelo nifdu. If you didn't redeem maaser sheni and you ate it, you'd be liable, right? Lashes. So now they say, what is that if not you didn't redeem it and you ate it outside Jerusalem? Isn't that the same as this Mishnah? Tanina chadazimno. We already learned that. Maaser sheni v'heikesh shelo nifdu. Isn't that the same thing? You didn't redeem them and you ate them outside the walls of Jerusalem. So how do we explain that the Mishnah Aleph lists one case and Mishnah Bet lists the exact same case? So Amar Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina, he says, no. Seifa b'maaser sheni tahor v'gavra tahor deka'achel chutz l'choma. Okay, the seifa is clearly as it says. You ate maaser sheni outside the walls of Jerusalem, you were tahor, the maaser sheni was tahor, everything was good, it's just the location was the issue. Reisha, but the first case, when it says you had maaser sheni, you didn't redeem, is talking about maaser sheni tameh v'gavra tameh v'ka'achele b'Yerushalayim. Now it's either or. Either. Now, the scene is you're not anymore outside Jerusalem. You're actually in Jerusalem, where you're supposed to eat your maaser sheni. But what happened? Either you were impure or the maaser sheni became impure, and you were pure. Then you're going to get lashes. Now the Gemara says, well, where's the source for the fact that you have to eat it when you're pure? Because remember, we said it's not really kodshim. Okay, it's a little tricky. So kind of say it's not kodshim, but it is sort of kodshim. Okay, so they say the following: Titania, Rabbi Shimon Omer. The first thing he's going to quote is from the Vidoi Maasrod. Just like we have this ceremony we're supposed to recite when we do the bikkurim, there's times during the cycle of the 7 years where you have to do what's called Vidoi Maasrod. You make a confession about your maaser and you say, I did everything the way I was supposed to do it. And one of the words you say there is Lo bi'arti mimenu b'tameh. I didn't consume it. Okay, bi'arti usually is to burn, but some of the commentaries explain that what we mean here is, right, like bi'or chametz. One of the ways you can accomplish bi'or chametz is, right, we always burn our chametz on Erev Pesach, this year, the day before Erev Pesach, but you can also destroy it by eating it, right, consuming it. In fact, it's always fun before Pesach. You can say, oh, I'm doing a mitzvah just by eating, right? I'm eating chametz, I'm getting rid of it. So when it says lo bi'arti mimenu b'tameh, it also includes I didn't eat it when I was impure, not just burn it when it was impure. Okay, but I didn't eat it when it was impure. Burning it when it was impure, what they mean is burning it like to use as a fire to cook my food. Okay, but also because you could burn things that are tameh, but you can't burn it for use. So anyway, from there you see ben shani tameh v'hu tahor, ben shani tahor v'hu tameh, right? Whether I am tameh and the food was tahor, or whether I am tahor and the food was tameh. But but what's the issue? He says, I don't really know though. Now, this is part of the confession, which is clear that it's forbidden, but it doesn't help because to get lashes, you need a warning. You need it to say somewhere, don't eat it. So he says, I don't have a proof for eating the maaser sheni. I can't find a warning for eating maaser sheni. This is what Rabbi Shimon saying. For eating it if the maaser sheni is tameh. But I can show you a pasuk which talks about if I am impure and I eat it, I'll get lashes. Where's the lota say? Nefesh asher tigabo, if you touch something that's going to get you impure, like a dead body. Well, this actually wouldn't be a dead body. This would be a sheretz. You'll be tamei until that night. Obviously, if you went to the mikveh in the morning, then your tumah will stay till the end of the day. V'lo yochal mina kodashim, and the kodashim includes. This is why I said it is somewhat kodesh. Lo yochal mina kodashim is maaser sheni. Okay, and there's my negative prohibition. But elatumat atzmo minayin. So now the Gemara says, right? Rabbi Shimon said, I don't know how you know that if the maaser sheni itself is tamei, that you also get lashes for it. So now the Gemara wants to know where. Let's find a source for it where Rabbi Shimon couldn't find dichtiv. So now they prove it from this, and it's going to take a little to understand this. Lo tuchal le'echol b'sharecha, right? You can't eat in your gates the maaser. That means, right, you can't eat maaser sheni until you bring it to Jerusalem. Ulahalanu omer b'sharecha tochlenu hatamei v'atahor. Told you we were going to get to the bechor who has a blemish. If you have a bechor, an animal, a firstborn, who's blemished, what do? You can eat it wherever you want. That's what it says, b'sharecha. You don't have to eat it in Jerusalem. And hatamei v'atahor, it's missing a key word, yachdav, can eat it together. B'tanya debei Rabbi Yishmael, I told you, just wait. We're going to see how this builds. And then we'll go back to the comparison of the psukim, which we didn't really explain yet. Tanya debei Rabbi Yishmael, afilu tamei v'tahor ochlim b'kara achat ve'en choshashim. If the bechor is blemished, even a tamei and a tahor person can eat them together, which means, number one, the tamei person can eat the blemished food. Not only that, they touch it, the other person then eats it. When they touch it, they make it tamei, and the tahor person can eat the tamei bechor meat. So what do you see here? When it comes to bechor, a tahor, if it becomes blemished, the tahor person can eat the tamei meat. Okay, so where is that going? We want to find out that maaser sheni can't be eaten if the maaser sheni becomes impure. So they say the following. Now, remember we compared these two psukim. It says you can't eat in your gates the maaser sheni. And then it says the blemished bechor you can eat in your gates, the tamei and the tahor together. So they compare the words gates, but notice the bechor can be eaten and the maaser sheni can't be eaten. So they're going to say, hey, okay, here. So Tanya de Rabbi Yishmael, he said on this, afilu tamei b'tahor ochlim b'kara chaven koshim. They have no problem. B'ka'am rachmana, hey, tamei desharelach gabei tahor hatam hachalo techal. Exactly the way that the tamei is allowed to eat, right? Meaning the tamei can eat the meat, make the meat impure, and then the tahor person can eat it, right? Hacha, in our case, a maaser sheni lo tochal. You can't eat it in that way, meaning you can't eat it if it became impure, and that's all because that one says b'sharecha tochlenu, and this one says lo tuchal lecho b'sharecha. So whatever way it could be eaten there, can't be eaten here, and from there we learn. Remember, we're learning from bechor to maaser. What bechor can be done, you can't do a maaser. It shouldn't bother you from before that we were learning what can't be done in both, because this is a blemish bechor. This is a totally different case. This is when it's not being sacrificed or anything else. And because of the word sha'arecha, we're going to learn what can't be done there, can be done there, because again, one says yes, do it, and one says don't do it. Okay. Now they're going to ask the following, which is Minalan de bar pdiyahu. Now our Mishnah said. So that was all to establish all we did so far. First, we said, both Mishnah would say the same thing. We had to say, oh no, one was chutz l'choma, that was our Mishnah. The earlier Mishnah was when it wasn't redeemed, meaning if you eat it when it's tahor or your tahor, which seems though if it's redeemed, it's fine. So how do you know that you can redeem something that became impure? And this we actually learned at the end of Sanhedrin. That if you're in Jerusalem and it becomes tahor, you can actually redeem it. Normally, you're not allowed to redeem anything in Jerusalem. Your maaser sheni can only be redeemed outside the city. Once you get into the city, you can't. But if it's in Jerusalem and it becomes impure and you can't eat it, you're actually allowed to redeem it. How do we know this? Talmud lomar ki lo tuchal se'eto ve'ein se'et el achila shenemar v'yisam masot me'et panav. Okay, this is by Yosef. He takes the masot, he takes the food from before his face, he takes the food from the table basically and gives it to his brothers. Masot is food. So when it says lo tuchal se'eto, which we normally interpret to mean you can't carry it because it's too far away, it also means you can't eat it. Okay? If you can't eat it, why can't you eat it? Because it became impure, you can actually redeem it. Because that's the pasuk that says, because it's too far to carry, right, you're allowed to redeem it. But now they say it's also because you can't eat it, you're allowed to redeem it, even if you're in Jerusalem and it became impure. Amra Bivi, Amra Rav Asi, they're going to darshan another thing from this pasuk. Minayin l'maser sheni tahor shepodino to afilu b'psi'a achat chutz l'koma. Now normally, again, we understand that pasuk to mean you're far away. What if you're one step outside Jerusalem? Classic Rabbi Yirmiyah type thing, even though it doesn't say it in his name right now. But you're one step outside Jerusalem, you could still redeem it. How do we know? Because Ne'amar, lo tuchal seito. You still, right? You still need to carry it. So you could say, I can't carry it that one more step. Okay, as long as you're still carrying it into Jerusalem, you can still redeem it as long as you haven't gotten into the city. So they said, what do you mean? How can you learn that from the pasuk we just learned? Lo tuchal seito is you can't eat it. Got impure. Well, im ken lemakra lo tuchal ochlo my seito. Right? So they say, it should have said you can't eat it if that's what it wanted to say. So the fact that it uses the word se'et, it could mean both. So now the Gemara says a classic when they do this, maybe the whole thing is coming to say really just carry, like we would have thought. And it's not coming about, right? If you're going to say it didn't say lochlo, it said seito, but why did it say seito? Seito really just seems to mean carry. Im ken lemakra lo tuchal litlo. My seito shma min atarti. Litlo, you can't take it, right? You could have said that also. You can't take it, meaning it's just too heavy to carry. So why did it say sa'ed, to carry? Because that word could be used in two meanings, and then that's how we get both. Okay, so again, that teaches if it's outside the city walls, even one step outside, you still could redeem it. And if you're inside, but it became impure, you also could because you can't eat it. Yatav Rav Chanina Rav Sheshet come a Another question. What if you're at the entrance to Jerusalem? What's the halacha? So the Gemara says pshita, right? It's obvious, and right, it's particularly obvious. Now, what they must mean here is you're at the entrance, but you're part in, part out. Okay, again, classic Rabbi Yirmiyah, right? Like you're half here, half there. So they say pshita. It's obvious. Hu b'chutzu masao b'fnim kaltuhu mechitzot. If you're inside and you're standing outside, but your back is turned and your back is inside the walls of Jerusalem, and your back is carrying your backpack with all your food in it. So if the food already went in the walls, obviously, katul mechitzot, as soon as the mechitzot accept it, right, it's in the walls. Number one, you can't take it out of the walls anymore. And obviously you have to take maaser, right? You can't redeem it anymore. You're in Jerusalem. But his question was, what if you're inside, but your bag is still outside and your food hasn't gone into the walls yet? Tana lehu saba b'dbei Rabbi Yishmael bar Yochai. So we had a Tana who Saba said, an elder said, I learned this from Rabbi Yishmael bar Yochai. Ki yirchak mimcha makom mim milu echa. When it says mimcha makom, they learn mimcha from milu echa, from everything you're carrying. Meaning, if your bag is with you, it means you and whatever's with you. So even if you went into the walls, it's as if the food went into the walls, even if it didn't yet. By Rav Papa, but Rav Papa asked, what if nakit lebekanya? What if you are one of those, the old-fashioned, you always see those, like the Meraglim, you imagine they have those big sticks, and then you have the little bag on the back of the stick, and it's far behind you. So what about that? You went into the city and your bag is way back. It's not on your back, and your back is already kind of in, but your bag isn't. So the Gemara obviously answers here, Teku, we don't know what the answer is. Okay. Now we're just going to end with this last part. Amar Rabbi Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, maaser sheni me'mataychem mechayvin alav. Now we started, if you remember, I told you we're going to end where we started. Bikkurim, at what point is a non-kohen who eats it going to be liable to get the death penalty, right? Because bikkurim aren't really bikkurim till you get into the temple. Okay? So here they're going to say, maaser sheni also, me'matay mechayvin alav. You're not allowed to eat maaser sheni outside Jerusalem, but surprisingly now, and that's what the Mishnah talked about, you get lashes for that. Surprisingly, they're going to say only mishara apnei choma. The issue is once, and that's obviously you can't eat them until you get to Jerusalem. But if you eat them before you get to Jerusalem, you're not going to get lashes. You're only going to get lashes if you brought them into the city and then took them out of the city. If you took the maaser sheni outside the city, after it was already in the city, that's when you're going to get lashes. Where does he get it from? My time, Adam Kra, Lifnei Hashem Elokecha Tuchlenu, Uchtiv Lo Tuchal Le'echol B'Sharecha. Kol Hecha Dekrina Be Lifnei Hashem Elokecha Tuchlenu, Krina Be Lo Tuchal Le'echol B'Sharecha. Again, we're going to put these psukim together and say, look, when it says eat them before God, and then it says, but you can't eat them in your gates, you're only going to not be able to eat them in the gates after they already were seen before God, meaning they made it into the walls. If you're not yet in Jerusalem, and that pasuk doesn't apply, okay, and that's what they say. However, we're going to start tomorrow. We're going to leave this for tomorrow because it's a big braita that kind of goes into tomorrow's daf. We're going to have a big question on this from a braita of Rabbi Yossi. Okay, so we'll get to that tomorrow. So like I said, we started and ended with a similar type question that both the bikkurim and the maaser, only once you go into either the temple, bring them into the temple, or bring them into Jerusalem and then take them out, and then the zar eats them, are we going to be liable the punishment, right? Each one was different punishment, but that it's not actually really got all the halachas of it until you actually bring it into the place of the sanctity. And then in between, we got into all sorts of other things. Mainly, we dealt with this Rav Sheshet sugya about bikkurim hanachama kevet behem and not kriya. We tried to bring a source of Rabbi Yishmael to prove it, which had a very long, 3 sections of the braita. And then once we rejected that whole comparison, Rav Ashi said, "Oh, that one line about bikkurim that you thought we could derive this halacha of Rav Sheshet, it's not true." And then we had a question both on the failed attempt to make a b'memetzinu, and they said, why don't you do atzara shaveh, the least common denominator? And then they say, because that doesn't match up either. And then we said, where do you even get it that bechor can't be done in the time of the temple when there's no temple? Maybe if all the stuff was done, but then the korban happened, maybe you could eat the meat. And then they showed how we know that, and that was all this heikesh, or maybe not a heikesh, right? Depending on your approach about double heikeshes. Then we got to the maaser sheni in our Mishnah, which seemed to match the same thing as the previous Mishnah, and then we had to explain they're each 2 different things. From there, we got to the issue of tuma of maaser sheni and how you know what's the source for person being tameh and the food being tameh, that they can't be in Jerusalem. And then what do? You redeem it, which was obvious from the Mishnah. What's the source for that? And from there, we got into different halachot about redeeming the maaser sheni. From there, we finished for today, wishing everyone a Shavua Tov and B'sorot Tovot and almost a Chodesh Tov also.